Thank you all for standing by and welcome to our webinar entitled Understanding and Potentially Mitigating the Impacts of Tile Drainage. This webinar series called Freshwater Science will highlight Ohio Sea Grant and partnering scientists every month. Every quarter is a different focus, from human health and fish farming to harmful algal blooms and human decision making, bringing applied research to the public on issues that affect our Lake Erie communities. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dr. Steve Lyon from The Ohio State University. Dr. Lyon's research uses innovative approaches to characterize hydrological processes and engage people across scales to improve resource management in the face of coupled climate and land use change. He works at the intersection of water chemistry and hydrometric observations, often leveraging GIS, remote sensing products, and geostatistical approaches. Dr. Lyon came to Ohio State in 2019 as an associate professor of hydrology and water resources, and is now associate director for the School of Environment and Natural Resources on the Ohio State Worcester campus. We're delighted to have Dr. Lyon here to talk to us about his research. Before we do that, just a few things about the webinar. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, around 12:20, I will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to pull up that chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. And I will pose out any of your questions to him starting around 12:20. As a reminder, this webinar has auto captioning and is being recorded to be posted on our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the half an hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It will help us continue to bring you better webinars. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lyon, presenting Understanding and Potentially Mitigating the Impacts of Tile Drainage. Dr. Lyon, I think you should be good.
Excellent. Thanks, Jill. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. And there you see some slides. And great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for this opportunity to chat about some of the research we've been doing here in Ohio over the past few years. And thanks everybody who joined today for sharing World Water Day with me. This is great. What a timely thing to talk about tile drainage and the impacts those are having on our streams. So wonderful. Hopefully you're all celebrating World Water Day on this Wednesday. Let's see here. So just to give an overview, what I want to try to cover today in the time we have. So I'm going to talk about kind of two main aspects of some work we've been doing. First, looking at how subsurface tile drainage has potentially been, impacting the streams across Ohio, how it's altering our stream flows, and some work we've done there. And then I'll look into some research we're doing now and continuing forward about some potential management practices to try to kind of mitigate or change that impact a little bit. So a methodology called controlled drainage, if you haven't heard of that before, so drainage water management. So into that first kind of objective of how tile drainage has worked and how it impacts streams in Ohio. It's always think it's good to start with a refresher about what tile drainage is, or subsurface drainage. And for those who are not familiar with agricultural landscapes, it's that underground pipe and tubing systems that we use, perforated plastic pipes that are spaced and laid underneath farm fields to help drain out water during periods of time. So the goal of it is literally to lower the water table, shown in that graphic on the right there, to allow for root penetration, aeration, and increase crop productivity, and also to increase trafficability, the ability to drain out those fields, dry them out fundamentally in wet locations. Helps us, helps farmers be able to get out there with heavy machinery, so tractors and whatnot, as they need to plant and harvest and work with their fields. So those are the motivations for why folks use tile drainage. And, it's become a ubiquitous or a big part of agriculture, especially across the Midwest. Some recent work showing kind of the extent of it here on these two graphics of the lower 48 states. So on the left there, census data looking at a county scale, where the bluer colors are higher acreages of tile drainage systems in farm fields. And that image on the right there, that purple smudge color, that's a high resolution estimation of locations with tile drainage across the US. And you can see by and large, those locations then concentrate in the Midwest. And it's about like over 80% of tile drainage is in those 6 states there. And you can see Ohio here highlighted. By and large, tile drainage, especially in the north and west, in that flat part of the agricultural state that we live in. And so we were interested in looking at a little bit, how does all that tile drainage impact stream flows across the state? And so we started looking at some USGS geological survey data, so some stream flow data, and then about 60 watersheds. Here in this image, these black squiggly lines without the outlines of watersheds across Ohio, where we have continuous stream flow data available from the USGS. That gray smudgy color here, then that's that high resolution imagery or that modeling that I talked about earlier, showing where tile drainage is. So we actually just intersected those two things. We said, what's the percentage of tile drainage in a watershed, and how does that stream flow look historically? So first, some basic results. We looked at, here in these graphs, how does the landscapes work for those watersheds? So across the x-axis there in the image on the right, as we have more agricultural land in a watershed, we see this uptick in Ohio in tile drainage percentages. So each dot here is a watershed. So for high percentage agricultural land, we have high amounts of tile drainage in that system. Then we also looked at what kind of landscapes these are. As we move from flatter landscapes to steeper landscapes, from the left to the right here, we see this decrease in tile drainage. So obviously flat areas where water tables want to hang out near the surface, we put tile drainage in there to pull down that water table. Whereas the steeper locations, more mountainous or more hilly terrains, those naturally want to drain out, right? So this type of analysis here just confirms that, the data we're working with makes some physical sense for a landscape. So relating that back to then like stream flow responses, we looked at hydrographs, so long-term 30 years of data, how streams respond under these different systems. So again, percentage of tile drainage across the bottom axis here, increasing from left to right. We looked at two kind of metrics of flow. Look at the high flow response, or what we call the flashiness, and then the low flow response, which we call the base flow. So starting with that high flow flashy response, we see that as we increase the percentage of tile drainage in a watershed, that stream has a flashier response. What's a flashy response? So when it rains and the stream goes up quickly and comes down quickly, we would call that a flashy response. So we can look at that as a metric of flashiness for a system. So as we increase the tile drainage in a watershed, we've seen that there's a corresponding increase in that flashiness of the stream flow at the watershed boundary. Counter to that, the low flow tends to decrease as we increase that tile drainage percentage. What does that mean? So tile drainage, again, remember, to pull down the water table, take water out of storage and move it through the system. Watersheds no longer hold on or are spongy anymore. They kind of release their water out. So we actually have a lower base flow than we would anticipate as we increase that amount of tile drainage across those systems. So these systems are doing what they're supposed to do, right? They're increasing the ability of water to move through the landscape, pulling down water tables, and that's good for the farmland, but it's also impacting our stream flow responses we see across scale. Connected with that, then we also looked a little bit at how does that impact kind of the nutrient transport and the nutrient loading coming from these systems. And so we went to a subset of those kind of 60 some odd watersheds we were looking at, that kind of large scale data set. And we said, okay, here's about 14 or so watersheds highlighted across the Western Lake Erie Basin, so the northwest part of the state. These are locations where not only do we have that high quality, high resolution USGS stream flow data, but we also have nutrient data available for longer term monitoring. So some resolution, some monitoring of both nitrogen and phosphorus data coming out of those watersheds. And we said, oh, well, how does that relate? How do these nutrient concentrations or loads relate back to those tile drainage systems? And so we wanted to look at that over time. And so we kind of isolated two main years where we had high quality data across all of those locations. And so this is primarily a wet year and a dry year response to the nutrient loading across those watersheds. And so again, here on the left, we see the reaction, the response for the soluble reactive phosphorus. So the phosphorus coming out of the watershed, and here on the right, the nitrogen response. And what do we see? So if we start with the nitrogen, we can see that for the orange dots, the dry year response across those 14 watersheds, and for that wet year response, the blue dots here, we see kind of the same thing, don't we? As you have more tile drainage in your system, you kind of see a general increase with the loading of nitrogen. And it doesn't seem to vary if it's a wet or a dry year. Nitrogen tends to move with groundwater, right? So it wants to go into the ground, soak in, and move laterally in the subsurface. And so this is not overly surprising that there's a consistent response. These systems are draining out nitrogen every year in that kind of similar way, wet or dry. Counter to that, if we look at soluble reactive phosphorus response over here on the left-hand side of this image, we can see that here as we increase that drainage percentage, we get a different response whether the systems are dry, these orange dots again, or if they're wet. So in a wet year, we see this strong relationship between the loading of reactive phosphorus relative to that drainage. I suppose that dry year, we see this kind of a more flat response. So again, we get a variable response in our loading depending on wet or dry conditions for phosphorus. And that can also make some sense as this is surface applied phosphorus that can actually, be flushed through that system either quickly or perhaps be contributed through other flow pathways or other pathways out of the system. So we can see that depending on if we're in a wet or dry year, the phosphorus may be responding differently as it moves through our watershed systems. However, we can definitely see across both nutrients, and as we have more tile drainage systems, we definitely have active pathways by which we can get nutrients transported from those agricultural fields through to our river systems. And so that made us start to wonder about, what are the management practices or what kind of options are available for us to kind of start, want to start to mitigate some of these potential impacts these tile drainage systems have. So thinking about how could we impact not just the nutrient loading itself, but also the flow of water through these systems and sort of mitigate or trying to offset some of those impacts. And we started doing research and working with folks who've been doing research and looking at management options and potentially one called controlled drainage. And so here's a simple schematic of this type of management practice, agricultural management practice that treats tile runoff, tile drainage systems. And this has been around for a while, and we're looking at it here. And just to show kind of how it works schematically, on the left-hand side here, this is a conventional tile drainage system. We have that underground pipe that I was talking about earlier, this tile line or subsurface drainage, pulling down the water table to that level, helping promote root growth of this cornfield, for example. What is controlled drainage? Well, controlled drainage builds a control structure at the outlet of that system, whereby you can use riser boards or valves basically to stop that flow of that tile system. So what can you do? You can open and close a valve at the outlet of that tile drainage system, literally turning it on and off, allowing us to back water up into that farm field, raising that water table or lowering it as we feel from our management perspective. We can do this for periods of time because, for example, if we're lowering this water table to increase trafficability, we maybe don't need to have a drained field during the winter period, for example, when no one's out planting or harvesting. And counter to that, if there's no crop on the field in the winter or no deep root penetration needed, well, then it's okay to have a higher water table during that period. So holding water back maybe in the winter or maybe sporadically throughout the summer periods as well can be a benefit, not just for the crop or for the field, but also for the environment as well. And so these systems aren't new. These have been around, controlled drainage, this idea of altering water flow pathways through drainage has been around for, over 50 years at this point. What's getting more and more modernized are these control structures and how they work. And that's what we looked into a little bit. We did that at a field here at the Worcester campus of Ohio State. And we looked at what was called automated drainage water management. So this is the same type of system, this idea of controlling that outlet and adjusting the level of water in a farm field or the tile drainage flows with these type of valve systems. And the automated part here comes into play is that we actually use sensors or the measurements of the water flow in that outlet structure to control when the valve that releases drainage water opens and closes. So it's no longer a manual judgment call or something that a farmer has to manually go adjust. The automation allows that system to open and close on its own. It relieves the amount of time it takes for farmers to manage the system and also takes some of the guesswork out of, should I open this or should I not open this valve? And so for our experiments, what we did for about a year or so, a little over a year, we monitored how a farm field, how a cornfield here at the OARDC responds under automated drainage water management. And so this field here is what you see in the image. You can see here in the aerial image here, you can see the tile lines on contour. And we monitored hydrologic response, water table position, and water chemistry in the field across a few locations, these white dots. We also measured it across the edge of the field at the riparian zone here, the buffer edge right here. So in the farm field or at the edge of the field. We wanted to understand how does changing, here's the outlet valve right here in the white square. How does opening and closing this valve alter the flow of water as it either predominantly goes through the tile drainage system or it flows through this edge of field? How are these different flow pathways where water can leave this field, how are those being altered? And what happens to the water chemistry along the way? And so that's really what we looked at. And so just to show some of the results from that work, as we moved it forward, we can first start with how does that an automated drainage water system management really work? So looking at automated drainage water management, here we see what the system actually looks like. So on the right-hand side is that buried control structure with a valve where it's basically a sluice gate that opens and closes by an actuator connected to some telemetry data, so they can call up to the cell phone network to automate and record information, and some powering system. All right, so basically what happens is a programmer or a farmer or somebody else, an agent, can set a level of water that we want to achieve in the structure. And as the water in this outlet structure rises to that level, if we pass that set point threshold, that valve can open to drain out the system. It's pretty nifty. And here's what it looks like in practice. So here on this graph from our field, we have the water level in that structure. And we can see this blue line is constant blue line over time. This is the set point. That's the point where we says when the water table gets above this level in the structure, open the valve. And so the black line here that squiggles up and down, that's the water level in this control structure. So as it passes the blue line, the valve would open to pull it back down. And you can see that it oscillates back and forth after a rainfall event, slowly getting lower and lower, and that the amount of time where this valve comes open is changing as well. We see this response to our system. So this is how it's controlling that water level in the outlet structure. And now this red line here is the response of the water table then in the farm field. So we see in the beginning, the water table rises. As the valve opens, it starts to release water out. We see that pull down of the water in the farm field. So this is how it's controlling it. In response to that rainfall event, we're actually pulling that water table down. And so these systems, what they tend to do then is fluctuate open and close kind of consistently. So they're no longer kind of in an open and a closed setting. What they're doing is they're actually actively managing water and responding all the time. And so we kind of looked at that a little bit and I tried to understand how can we isolate individual rainfall events or rainstorm events and how that responds across that system. And so what this graphic shows here is the hydraulic response or the gradient of water as these kind of individual rainstorm events. Here you see kind of these peaks in this groundwater time series here, how the system responded. So what this shows is the orange line and the blue line are literally just two water table positions in that farm field. And when these two lines are far apart from each other, there's a gradient, there's a push of water from that farm field kind of towards the tile drainage system. However, when those two lines get close to each other, that gradient actually is shifted to a different direction and shifts the water wants to drain from that farm field kind of through the edge of the field. So the tile drain is kind of not responding or not draining out that system as well. So we're seeing a shift in how that system wants to drain out. Looking across this period of time, these red arrows are highlighting the periods where there's rainstorm events or precipitation events, and the system is fundamentally in a closed setting. The system's being managed actively. So we can see during these periods, we can see that the response, this gradient, is where these lines get close together relative to this period where the system is primarily open. Here, when we have a rainfall and a change in groundwater position, we see that the response is fundamentally different. Those two lines don't get close together, right? So that means that we have a difference in the hydraulic gradient or how water wants to leave this system relative if the system is functioning as an open or a closed type control system. Looking across the entire year then of where we collected data, we could see that, by and large, based on the management that we had, the valve was triggered open most often in spring. About 87 or almost 90% of the time, that system was open during the spring period. Why is that? It's the wetter period of the year, right? We have more water wanting to move through that system. So continuously we were triggering and opening up that valve system and releasing water. Also, because of the way these things are programmed management-wise, you set periods of time where you want to have a continuous open valve to allow free drainage, because things like planting, you want to be able to drain that field out to go out and be able to plant that farm field. Looking in general then across the entire period, looking at the hydrological response as well, we kind of characterize the whole system as being either open or closed. And how did the system respond? Well, over the period of time you looked at, about 94% of the discharge from that tile drainage happened during that open period, which makes sense. When it's closed, not much water leaves that tile drain. About 6% of all the water left during the period where the system was closed. That makes sense. These systems are working how they're supposed to work. We also saw different responses then in that kind of groundwater response at the edge of the farm field. Here's two examples of that. The top image here during an open period of time, rainfall on the left-hand side here, we can see the water table doesn't rise nearly as high towards the surface, kind of gets there very quickly and drains back down relative to what happens for a similar size rainfall event when that system is fundamentally closed and it's functioning. Here we can see more of a delayed response. This peak's a little bit more delayed and a higher overall rise in water table for this system. So very similar events with different responses at that edge of the field, indicating how that hydraulic gradient shifts as well. And then also important here is the time to discharge peak. So we monitor the flow coming out of this tile system and we say, oh, when does it peak relative to when the rainstorm event happened? And looking across all the events that we captured for this, about 17 some odd events for this field that we're looking at, we saw that when the system's fundamentally open, on the order of about 20 hours from rainfall to peak tile flow, whereas for the system being closed, about 40 hours. So about double the amount of time it took for this system to respond under a closed system. So what is it doing? It's delaying that flow to tile peak, which is actually kind of dampening by holding water back in. It's dampening the response of the system. So thinking back to those flashy responses we were talking about earlier for streams that have a lot of tile drainage, this type of dampening or slowing of that peak could help potentially offset some of those peaks as we achieve more and more of these systems in play, being able to control and the timing and flow of water. We also look then at the chemistry of the water, and this is some more ongoing work that we have in development right now. So here we have the nitrogen, the total nitrogen concentrations now here, and the total phosphorus concentrations. Those are what we're working with right now at different locations across that field I talked about. So we either look at the groundwater at the edge of the field, the groundwater kind of in that farm field, or the water coming out of the tile drainage itself. And these are kind of the averages over the entire period. And we're breaking these down, looking into more details with time. But we can think about this as, what are the chemical concentrations we're seeing across these different pathways or places for water to hang out. And I like to think about it as this, for example, if we're in the groundwater in the field, we have two choices, right? We can either leave the field by flowing through the tile drainage system, or we can leave the field by flowing through the edge of the field. And so we can see that for nitrogen, we see this kind of a little bit of an elevated concentration kind of coming through that tile discharge system. Whereas if we go through that edge of the field, we see a little bit, it's still elevated relative to the field as we accumulate groundwater flow towards that direction. However, it's relatively lower. So this is the type of thing where we think we're seeing, this is how these systems are actually also conserving some of that nutrient loading by altering this flow of water from tile drainage towards a lower concentration and leaking it out slowly through the subsurface. We're actually mitigating some of that load potential. But by and large, we're also controlling this by not allowing for this tile drainage to happen out during a period of time we have a closed system. This differentiation is much more pronounced for nitrogen relative to something like phosphorus. For phosphorus, we see it as well, but it's a little bit more kind of in the weeds, or a little bit more mixed up here with the flows. And this is consistent with some of the other research that's been done on these types of systems, because nitrogen tends to show a stronger, clearer response for these types of systems relative to phosphorus, which is a little bit more variable about setting and location. If we think back to kind of the things we saw at the large scale looking at tile drainage systems, that might be consistent as well. Remember, we saw for nitrogen, we saw independent of wet or dry, we're kind of always pushing out that same load as a function of tile drainage concentrations. Phosphorus was a little bit more variable depending on if it's wet or a dry year. So we might have actually, the devil might be a little bit more in the details here about phosphorus. Then we've made some estimates then, just kind of wrapping this up, thinking about when we see these peaks and when and how is water leaving the system and the load potentially contributing. And this is a little bit of a noisy graphic, but looking at time across kind of the individual seasons, we've made estimates then on kind of the load, the yield here, which is mass per area of the field. And we can see that, for both phosphorus and nitrogen, the springtime is that kind of peak load period, independent of if we're looking at water flowing through that tile drainage system or kind of fluxing through the subsurface. We've estimated this here. And we can see that orange is the load coming through that tile drainage system, and our estimation for the field, kind of edge of field estimation, is that blue. So we can see two things here. The peaks in the spring period, which is consistent with how people have seen in other locations. And what we're seeing is that by and large, most of the load seems to be estimated as coming through kind of that subsurface lateral flow for periods of time. And that just shows us something about how these things are contributing over time. Breaking down to the relative contributions for both nitrogen and phosphorus, we can see that it's that winter period where we have about an even distribution. Although we have a lower load, we have about a 50-50 split or so between the two different flow pathways. However, as we shift to that spring and then summer periods, we're really starting to see less coming through from that tile drainage system. So kind of some of the take homes that we've seen from this work and moving forward, thinking about the impact of drainage water management, from our field site here, and this is just one field site example, we've seen a kind of a delayed peak in discharge of the tile outlet and these altered hydraulic gradients to help reconnect that stream to the field to the stream. So we're altering the flow pathways, which is good from a mitigation perspective as we slow water down, also allow it to have more time to interact with the subsurface. Based on some of the chemistry we've seen, there seems to be, again, a greater potential reduction for nitrogen loading relative to phosphorus at this site, based on the data that we have in hand. And also thinking about the periods of time when these shifts could be biggest, it seems like that winter spring period could be targeted for the largest reduction potentials. And then looking across all of our system and time, when was the drainage water management that we looked at the most effective for retaining kind of water and holding it back? It seemed like there's two types of events that really worked well. These low intensity precipitation events during winter months seemed like those were able to be held back into the system because the system's fundamentally closed during those periods. Then also in the late summer periods where we had dry conditions, we seemed like we could hold back the moderate size rainstorm events in those periods of time as well. So those would be the targeted periods for improvement under this type of management. And so with that, I'd say thank you for your attention and for joining me for World Water Day and talking a little bit about this research. And I'm happy to take some questions as you look at all the people who helped do all this. And I want to acknowledge that this was, funded by the Ohio Department of Higher Education's Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. We have gotten quite a few great questions during Dr. Lyon's presentation. So let me get started and ask as many as he can get through. And then what questions that Dr. Lyon can't answer today, we'll post later on to the website with his answers. So, all right, so let me see. First question that we have, we've got right now is how have the redox conditions changed when controlled drainage is used? And how do these changes affect phosphorus and nitrogen loads?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, we have not looked at redox levels in the groundwater across these systems in this study. And so, yeah, that's one of the open realms of research still. So thinking about, as that groundwater rises up, what are we changing for that aerobic or anaerobic conditions and the ability to retain or promote retention in the system. So we haven't studied that here in this work per se. And I think it's an active field of research, especially around the soil health implications of what we're talking about. Because if we bring these water levels up and put things under, we could definitely reduce or change the redox in these systems. So yeah, not something we've done yet, but it's definitely being looked at across the region. All
right. We had a couple of questions dealing with cost and about the cost of the control structure, as opposed to existing conventional tile drainage.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's one of there's a couple of barriers to adoption, right? One of them is that absolutely, as always, cost. Any infrastructure has cost. Rough numbers, right? Controlled drainage structure in and of itself, let's put it at the order of let's say $4,000 is a rough number. Please don't quote me on any numbers. Adding in that automation then can bring that up to $13,000. So that's a significant bump in price right there. So these aren't necessarily free or cheap things. However, both systems then are eligible for EQIP cost offsets on the order of 75% as well. So there are subsidies available to help for these conservation practices. So yeah, so there comes with a price tag on the top of traditional drainage and things like that. However, there's offset available for that. And these systems can retrofit into existing tile drainage networks, which is one of the benefits of them in the general sense.
All right. Another question that we had was, is all tile water created equally? So
that's a great question. Yeah.
So infiltration and matrix flow through the soil profile versus influences from surface water.
I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about it. And I don't think it is all created equally, but that's just me. But I think we have to think about it in the long and the short of it. So I mean, yeah. So one of the things we're looking at moving down the road on this type of work is, so we'll start using tracer techniques, trying to disentangle kind of those different sources of water. Is it moving primarily as a matrix flow, this slow push of water through, kind of uniform flow of groundwater, or is it a preferential flow, a crack, where water wants to flow quickly to the tile drainage system? That's why we see these quick responses potentially. Or is it risers letting water in? And so if we use tracers, for example, like something I work with a lot is stable water isotopes, which have different signatures that get picked up with time and sources relative to rainfall and things like that. Can we actually disentangle some of those responses? Folks over in Indiana, Mark Williams and that group there, are doing a lot of isotope work as well. So there's some research out there starting to build around how is tile drainage, what's the composition of it. And I think that's part of this issue, because if we think about that phosphorus, and how phosphorus loves to stick onto stuff, right? So you either have this promotion on sediments, and can those move underground, or can those get quickly to the ground and through the tile systems? Or are we looking at particulates that are coming through, or even colloidal systems nowadays? I mean, so this continuum of how phosphorus can be structured is one of the complicated things, thinking about how we do these practices and what effective practices look like moving forward. Along that line, because it's probably not all created equal, there's no silver bullet. This is not a silver bullet, right? There's this in combination with other management practices, kind of tiered or layered approaches, are going to be what's going to be required to treat some of these issues for harmful algal blooms down to Lake Erie, for example.
Have you also looked at dissolved phosphorus? And if so, does it act more like nitrogen rather than total phosphorus?
Yeah, unfortunately for this study, we can't those samples, because this was I'll be honest, because it was a pandemic COVID study, when there's a lot of this, that, and the other thing that happened along our supply chain and our things, we don't have access to those data for this study. Moving forward, we're looking at that as well to see how that looks. And that goes back to this idea that dissolved phosphorus, what we think of as what goes through, scientifically, what goes through a 0.45 micron filter is over here on the dissolved side, and everything else is over on this other side. Well, there's a continuum between there. And the question is, where are the breakpoints where physical screening of things hold it back into the system versus where is it chemically moving or moving through water? And it's a fundamental question to ask. Yeah.
How does agronomic factors such as surface crusting and compaction impact water movement into and through the soil profile?
Sure. So yeah, so if you have processes like surface crusting, which can create like a hard crusting at the surface, literally, or compaction, which can make tighter layers at the top relative to deeper flows like that, they can alter the flow pathways as you change kind of the structure of that soil, right? So if the water wants to rain, you think about it always as a balance, right, of the intensity of the rain coming down and the infiltration ability of that soil to take it and transport it either down or over. So if it's a parking lot, right, it goes over because it can't go down. And if it's a big sponge, it can go down as long as it doesn't rain too hard. So as we're altering those surface properties through things like crusting, for example, that can actually create overland flows in different situations. Why things like cover crops, which help reduce that ability to crusting, can actually help promote some of those infiltrations and things like that.
Sorry, I'm crossing off these questions as we're getting through these. This is great.
And if your question isn't asked, feel free to email me or contact me, and I can absolutely happy to continue a conversation.
We had several people asking whether or not they would be able to get some of the reports used as the references in your presentation. Would that be possible?
Absolutely. I can provide PDFs to you, Jill, and we can have those posted, or I can give you the links directly to them. Absolutely.
Perfect.
Fully available.
All right. I'll add that into our questions, and then we'll be able to get those links. Another question that we got was, are there other management strategies that can be used on fields where controlled drainage is not feasible?
Yes. No, yeah. And it goes back to this idea. There's, if we go back to like, there's many approaches that we can put in combination or something. So like things like edge of field type approaches, like bioreactors and things that you can alter and flow water through to help do chemical reactions on the water leaving from tile systems. If you can't do controlled drainage because, for example, the physics doesn't make sense if it's too steep of a field or something like that. So there are bioreactors and reactors like that can actually literally filter that water. There's preventative things. You think about it as a chain of management, right? I can do the 4 R's. I can do right place, right time. When I put things on the field, I can have crops on the field, cover crops and things that help keep things where they should be at. And then as we leave the field, I can do things at the edge of that field, control drainage, for example, or these type of buffer strips and these types of other practices. Then even down into the streams themselves, and we can actually have other practices as well. And so we think about that kind of chain of management from the beginning all the way, let's say all the way down to Lake Erie, for example. We have to question, when do we intervene? And how can that change us? What's the economic incentive to do it when we would do it? What's easier to do and what pays more higher return on investment? And so that's what I'm thinking. All these things always have different advantages and weaknesses, and in combination across many different approaches, hopefully we can see this kind of change down that system.
All right. I had one just clarifying question, and you know how we had talked about not referencing, or we were like, we're not going to reference slides. Well, I have one that was a slide reference. Someone was asking about the tiny black triangles on what she thought was slide 14, the drainage areas. Do they indicate direction of flow in each of these areas?
That's a good question. I have to go back to my slide now and see if I can find tiny black triangles. Probably not. I don't think I had any flow directions on anything. So yeah, I'm going to go with the probably not.
Okay. And then two last questions, because we're starting to, I was realizing what time it was. One was, someone had asked whether or not would you be able to share your GIS data set? Would that be something that was available to people? Was one question.
Yeah, it can't. Yeah, I'll give the soft yes. Reach out to me directly to do that, because nothing I showed here should be proprietary or any problem with showing that. And to answer that question about those black triangles, I found them. Those were the locations where both nutrients concentrations and stream flow were monitored. So they're the outlets of the watershed. So in the broad sense, yes, they indicate the direction of the flow downriver, but they're just the locations of the outlets.
Okay. And then we had a question from a teacher asking whether or not you would be able to provide some data charts or graphs that could be shared to middle schoolers so they could possibly use it to engage in some small group discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then again, I mean, anything I presented here, I can definitely share over easily, and then it can help develop as needed. Because I mean, some of these things are like that flashiness of a stream, that'd be a good one. And it's something you can literally do. You have a ruler, you can measure it. You could come up with a number yourself. So yeah.
All right. So one last question, and then I will compile all the rest of them and send them over to Dr. Lyon to answer. Last question. Do you have a best guess estimate as to what percentage of peak flow can be delayed via controlled drainage?
I don't. I wish I did. I know. That would be a modeling study. It have to be large scale, and because it becomes an issue of location, timing, and place. You have to think about at what scale or implementation could we achieve this type of thing. So yeah, I don't have a number for that, a volume or a peak estimate.
All right.
It's a good question.
Of course, I would ask a question at the end that you cannot answer.
Yeah. I think it's a good thing to estimate as we think about water markets and trading rights upstream, downstream, because that is a potential flood mitigating practice right there. So I think there is value in that. And I think people are thinking about it.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll end this webinar then and thank Dr. Lyon again for your willingness to talk with us today about your research. It was really an excellent discussion. We got some really great questions. Also, a thank you to Christina Dierkes for her work organizing this webinar series. I did want to remind everyone that we have a survey URL for this webinar in the chat feature, so please feel free to take a few minutes to fill that out. Our webinar series is sponsored by Ohio Sea Grant, and we'll be continuing next month with Ohio Sea Grant Extension's Tori Gabriel, who will be talking about his charter captain business survey work. The registration link is in the chat. Thank you again, Dr. Lyon, for all of your great work and great answers to questions, and all participants on this webinar. We hope that this was really beneficial and hope that you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Lyon, and have a great afternoon. Happy Water Day.
Thanks, Jill.
All right, thank you.